Let's begin with a prayer for light and guidance. God, our enlightenment, all the holy angels, strengthen the lights of our minds, order and illuminate our images, and help us to consider and think more correctly. Compared to the medieval art that went before it, and even compared to most all art from other cultures and times, the art of the Renaissance is strikingly more naturalistic and realistic. And one of the elements in that naturalism or realism is the use of perspective. In this change from a very stylized art in the Middle Ages to a much more realistic, naturalistic art in the Renaissance is one of the greatest and most dramatic changes in the arts of any culture or civilization. So the question I want to address is why? Why did this happen? What were the causes of this change? What were the causes of the more naturalistic art of the Renaissance? And in exploring this question and looking into the causes of this change, we're also looking at some of the principles, some of the beginnings of the modern Western world and now of our whole world and of its modern intellectual and artistic customs. Our customs of thinking, choosing, and making. So first, I want to kind of clarify the question and support what I think the actual question is and remove the question, what the question is not. After clarifying the question, then in answering it, I'll look at it in three parts. We'll move from the effects to the cause. So first, looking more closely at the effects, what are the changes in the Renaissance art, especially painting? And then we'll look at what the cause was. And finally, go back and kind of trace out how this cause actually was a cause of these changes in art and their elements, kind of how it accounts for what we see in the art. So the question is not why did people take so long to become able to paint correct perspective, naturalistic effects of light and shadow, as if all cultures and artists were trying to paint realistically and just weren't capable of doing that. That's not the question and not the case, and neither is the question why did some new kind of form of consciousness evolve at this time from some mysterious source, as if people for some strange reason at this time became aware of perspective, became aware that things look smaller in the distance than they do close up, as if they weren't really conscious of that. And so that's not the question either. What the question is, and I'll give some support for this, is why did people at this time and place become so interested in perspective and realism, and why did they choose to focus on this in their art at this time? So to support and make more manifest what the question is, let's look at some examples from some other cultures who chose and gave reasons for their other ways of painting and for not focusing on the single viewpoint apparent perspective. We'll move from the east and toward the west, and then end up in Europe and the Renaissance. Starting in the Far East, in China, we have a very interesting and illuminating example of a culture that considered using single viewpoint perspective and rejected that in their painting, and also gave us their reasons for that. And we have a text from the brilliant kind of polymath Shenhua, who was born in 1031 AD, so hundreds of years before the Renaissance. Awareness of perspective was there, and certainly much before that. But it came up as in art, in the painting, and Shenhua leaves us a text giving reasons for not focusing on single viewpoint perspective in art. And his reason is that that's too restrictive. Why restrict oneself to only what one can perceive from a single stationary viewpoint? And this goes along with a more common way of Chinese painting and Japanese painting, that it's more from memory than from standing in one spot and painting and then looking and correcting back and forth. So the painter of a mountain would go out and walk around the mountain and contemplate the mountain and come back and paint the mountain from memory, including multiple points of view, multiple impressions. So here is part of the text from Shenhua. He says, "This is absurd. All landscapes have to be viewed from the angle of totality, the angle of the whole, to behold the part. If we apply Lee's method to the painting of real mountains, we are unable to see more than one layer of the mountain at a time. Could that be called art? Li Ching surely does not understand the principle of viewing the part from the angle of totality. His measurement of height and distance is certainly a fine thing, but should one attach paramount importance to the angles and corners of buildings?" There's an example of a culture that clearly chose to pursue other paths and other approaches to painting than were chosen by the Renaissance. Now moving a little further westward into India, where Buddhism started and Buddhist art started, and then it spread to China and Japan. But the Buddhists, in their art, as did the Hindus, had a hierarchy of art. And the more kind of symbolic, abstract an image was, the better it was. And the more kind of realistic or sensory or connected with sensory appearance it was, the kind of lower or lesser it was. And in the sense of this hierarchy, in the sense of its relation to the purpose of human life. So for them, the purpose of art is subordinate to the purpose of life. And the purpose of life is to contemplate and unite with a reality that is beyond all forms and appearances, while being the source of all forms and appearances. So the closer art is to this formlessness, the better it serves the purpose of human life, this contemplative purpose. A text from Dietrich Seckel. So he says that for Buddhism, the image's essential purpose is to help the believer overcome all sensory form-bound perception. So the more abstract a visual sign is, the truer and more effective it is. An image fulfills its purpose all the more if it reaches the boundary of all form and allows the step into the realm beyond all form. The image should hint at the basically invisible and ungraspable truth in such a way as to avoid the spiritual impediments of images. The hierarchy of reality is the formless, and then the images that are kind of at the edge of form, and then the more form-bound sensory images. In the earliest Buddhist art, there were no images of the Buddha. There were just symbols, like footprints or a wheel. And only later did they paint or sculpt figurative images of the Buddha. But about those images, Seckel says, even the Buddha image, which arose later, is only an illusory reflection of true reality, for this lies beyond all human dimensions and categories. And perspective would be included in those human dimensions and categories. The Buddha image provides a support and aid in meditation upon this reality, and its form must be such that it transcends itself, that it makes the beholder forsake all notions limited by samsara, and leads him to that which lies beyond all form. And this principle was also behind the Far Eastern landscape painting of the Chinese and Japanese, the principle that the most real is beyond form, sometimes described with only negative terms like void and empty, relative to form, though full of power and luminosity to manifest all form. So Titus Burckhardt says this about the Far Eastern landscape painting. A Far Eastern painter is a contemplative, and for him the world is as if it were made of snowflakes, quickly crystallized and soon dissolved. He is always conscious of the non-manifested reality underlying all phenomena. The less solid the physical conditions are, the nearer they are to this underlying reality. Hence the subtle observation of atmosphere that we admire in Chinese paintings in ink and wash. In looking at the reasons behind the artistic choices made by other cultures, choices that were different than those made by the Renaissance, a couple principles emerge that can help us in understanding the arts of the Renaissance and other cultures. One is that for a culture or civilization, the purpose or purposes, but the purpose of art is subordinate to and contained in the larger purpose of life, of human life, for us seen by the culture. And the purpose of life is the culture's ideal or goal, or what Shakespeare called their chief good. What is most wanted or desired or considered the best, the most desirable. And that is related to what the culture, how the culture views reality, the world, their world picture. And within that world picture, central is what is considered most real, or as the Buddhists sometimes say, true reality. So for some of the Eastern cultures, true reality, or what is most real, is formless, not sensible. The sensible forms and appearances of things are less real than what is not sensed and formless. So a culture has both a view of what is the main purpose of life and what is best in life, and what is most real and what is less real. And a change in a culture's art can reflect a change in what they consider the main purpose of life and what they consider more real and less real. So we'll look at that in the Renaissance as the art changed from the medieval to the Renaissance styles. What was the change in the purpose of life and in what is more real or less real for Western European culture? Continuing to move westward from India to the Middle East, and there was a book written in Egypt, Alexandria, in 300 BC, called the Optics. It is a book about pretty much what we would call perspective. It's the mathematics, the geometry of visual appearances of things. And this book was used by the Renaissance artists and thinkers in their study and writings about perspective. And this book was known by the Byzantines. It contains many geometrical proofs about the appearances of things, how things visually appear. Here's one where the author is asking whether the ratios in which things appear as they go into the distance is proportional to the distance. So this drawing here, we could imagine that someone is, say, looking at some buildings that are on a street. So the person is here, and maybe there's a building there, and there's another building the same size, but it's further away, say it's twice as far. The treatise, the book of the Optics in this proposition is asking if the object of the same size is twice as far away, will it appear half, will it be in the inverse ratio of the distance? If it's twice as far, will it look half as big? And he shows that it's not, that the size is not exactly in the inverse ratio of the distance. Again, this is 300 BC in Egypt, writing mathematically about perspective. We have evidence that the ancient Greeks and Romans would use perspective in their theater arts for scenic paintings. And this book, The Optics, was known by the later Byzantines, and the great Byzantine artists would use their knowledge of optics or perspective in their buildings of great architecture, great churches, and in thinking about how things should be placed and painted, how they'd be seen at distances. So at the same time, the Byzantine architects were thinking about perspective and the mathematics of perspective in their architectural spaces. They were decorating them with paintings, Byzantine icons that were deliberately distorting perspective. So again, this is showing and more evidence to emphasize that people were conscious of perspective, that there were mathematical works about perspective that were even sources for the Renaissance thinkers and artists. This one going back to 300 BC in Egypt, but that architects were using them, but at the same time, they were decorating things with paintings that were using a distorted perspective, inverse, reverse perspective, making us wonder, okay, so why, given that perspective, even mathematics of perspective, was known at other times in other cultures, what changed? So in answering that, we'll look more closely at some of the art. What were the changes? So those are the effects. And after having specified those a little more, then we will go to explain what were the causes of these effects, these changes. So the effects are the forms of the art. The styles, and whether it's more realistic or less realistic, whether it has perspective. These are the formal elements of the art. And the causes are the makers of the art and their purposes or intentions in making the art. And the makers are not just the artists, like the painters, but they are even kind of more so the patrons, the people who are commissioning the art, and the dominant class or caste of that culture, who have their own purposes, their own intentions, and desires, and functions or uses of for their art. The way I'm going about it is to show how a change in makers and purposes or intentions is the cause of the change in the forms of the art. Let's start here by looking at some examples, seeing what are some of the actual elements of the changes from the medieval to the Renaissance painting. Comparing these two paintings, the one on the left from the medieval times, 1300s, the one on the right by Botticelli, a Renaissance painting, what are some of the things we notice? Well, the first obvious one is perspective. This one by Botticelli has depth and perspective, and one of the basic elements of perspective is that things that are the same size in reality appear to diminish as they get further back. Squares on the ground, the sides that are closer to us are bigger than the sides that are further from us. Whereas in this medieval icon, the perspective looks quite off, but it's a very well painted image. This is an example of inverse perspective. So sometimes not only as in like realistic perspective, we have a box or a table. As it goes back, the backside is smaller than in the front. In the icon, they're making the back get bigger as it recedes. So they're reversing the apparent perspective. So we can see that on this box that's under the throne, it's widening. We can see that on the building here, it's getting bigger as it goes back, as further away from us. So we see that in a lot of places. This not only is the perspective not how perspective appears, but it is the reverse or the opposite. Another thing we can notice is that in the medieval painting, if we look at the light, things do, in this icon, there is some shading. There's some shadow going around the edge in here. It's not that there's no shading or shadow, but in some things, like this side is darker than that, and the top is lighter. So it does give them some form, which we'll look at. The Romanesque art would not even do that. But what's the difference? Well, in this medieval icon, nothing is casting a shadow. So though there's internal shadows, there's no external cast shadows. So we see the angel Gabriel over here is casting this shadow. So the light is kind of coming from like this direction, and these are the highlights, and there's the cast shadow. Mary is casting a shadow on, I guess, her throne. In the icon, there are no cast shadows as far as the light. So the perspective is different and the light is different. So here, things cast shadows. This is a interesting difference in a lot of ancient art. You'll see that things don't cast shadows. Sometimes they'll have no inner shadows, but sometimes they will, but nothing will cast a shadow. So it gives a different, very different feeling if you're in a world where nothing cast a shadow. So we'll think about a little more what the reasons for that might be. So it's not that they don't know that things cast shadows, but they're not painting any cast shadows in this world. In these two examples, we have the same subject, the one on the left by Andrei Rublev in a more medieval style, and on the right by Albrecht Dürer in a Renaissance style. St. Paul here is casting a shadow so that we can tell that the light has a specific source in its direction. In the icons, it's hard to tell where's the light. Usually things in front have more light, and as they go back, they get less. But there's no clear direction because nothing casts a shadow. But then the light on the clothing of St. Paul is very different. His garment is fairly realistic. Probably someone might have had to pose for that to get those folds and shadows. But look at St. Paul's garment by Rublev. Look at the highlights. So there is a general form, you can tell, of the clothing. So there's light, and I'm going along here, some highlights here. But look at how the light is done. Here it's stylized, right? We don't see clothes with this kind of angular light. It's made of geometric shapes, rectangle, triangle, very sharp and angular. Look at these like layers. And it's imitating light on a crystal, right? So it's as if his clothing is made of crystal, right? It's very crystalline, transparent, faceted light. Whereas this is, by Dürer, is more natural light. And in the icon tradition, there's a teaching that there are different kinds of light. Or different lights. There's bodily light, which is the light that we see, maybe the natural light, the light of the eyes. But there's other lights, light of the soul and of the spirit, and even uncreated divine light. And the icons have elements of all these, but they're mainly interested in these lights of soul and spirit. So they came up with the idea of, to portray spiritual lights, one way is to use light on crystals, or transparent crystalline. So St. Paul here is painted not as he is in this life, but as he is in his eternal perfected form, in this crystalline, transparent, transfigured being. When I was studying with one of my icon teachers, we were looking at some examples, and she pointed out one, and she said, well, whoever painted that icon understood what the icon was about. And I said, well, what is it about? And she said, Xenia said, that the icon is about inner light, right, versus outer light. So the inner light, these are inner lights, but the bodily light, right, is outer light. And this is represented in the icon by some form, but the main interest is some kind of inner light. So it's almost as if St. Paul is glowing. There's an inner light coming from within. Whereas this painting by Dürer in the Renaissance, they were attending and focusing more on outer light or bodily light. Outer light is from outside, hitting the object and casting a shadow. The inner light is coming from within or from all around and everywhere. So that is another difference in medieval versus Renaissance. Not only the kind of perspective, but the kind of light that they were interested in portraying in their art. Comparing these two paintings, the Romanesque painting on the left and the Renaissance painting by Raphael on the right, both of Mary with the child Jesus. One thing to notice is the background. In the Raphael, we have a nice, beautiful Italian landscape in the background. And the background on the Romanesque painting is just a symbolic background. So this is a realistic Italian landscape, but in this one, the background is symbols. Right. This Mary is within this mandorla womb opening of the universe. So Mary and Christ are at the womb opening, the doorway of manifestation and creation. They're surrounded by these angelic beings who are purely spiritual, who have no visible form but are symbolized there. So the medieval art is much more symbolic. Renaissance is more realistic. There's still symbols in Renaissance art, certainly. But comparatively, it's also very centered and frontal. So they're positioned facing front, very geometrically balanced. And it's an image made for meditation, prayer, contemplation. Raphael's is also a prayerful image. It's different. It has other things going on. If you just wanted to enter a contemplative state, I think this Romanesque one would be more directly helpful. There's nothing like to distract you by noticing the beautiful landscape, the beautiful colors of the sky, the grass, the paths. The artist Paul Klee, he made a very nice division of art, kind of a spectrum of the visual arts. And he said, at one end of the spectrum is art that is wanting to represent the visible or represent what is visible to our eyes. So you could do a still life and you'd look at it and you'd see what's visible and you would kind of copy, represent the visible. But he said on the other end of the spectrum is art that wants to make visible something that is maybe not visible or less visible, somewhat invisible. And then there's art that kind of falls in between, maybe has a mixture of both. So in this one by Raphael, we have more representing of the visible. This could be how you might see, though it's very idealized and perfected, still you might see, and he might have used some studies and a model of, and to get the clothing and to look at the landscape. But in this Romanesque one, there certainly was no model and no study of the landscape. This is trying to make visible things that are invisible or visible to faith. So angels, invisible beings, the doorway, the womb opening of the universe, which is not something we see, say when we look at the sky, grasp it with our spiritual eye. So the medieval art was more toward this end of the spectrum, of trying to make visible things that are invisible. And the Renaissance moved more this way. It wasn't completely that. It was also symbolic and making things visible, but it moved much more in this direction of representing the visible. In the Renaissance, there was more interest in portraits and very individual portraits of actual individual people with unique characteristics, more kind of individual psychology. In icon painting, the only people who are painted are ones who have already gone through the door of death into the eternal realm. You don't paint still living people. And so we have unique individuals, more in Renaissance painting, with character and psychology portrayed. In learning icon painting, one learns a style based on a geometry. So you learn the basic geometry of a face, and then the style. How do you paint an icon eye? And it's pretty much the same in every icon. How do you paint an icon nose, an icon mouth? And you learn those and you repeat them. And it's very similar in Tibetan Buddhist painting, that you learn a geometry and you learn a style. How do you paint the eyes of a Buddha? How do you paint the nose, the mouth? And in Tibetan Buddhist painting, students will learn sometimes by painting in sand. The teacher will paint over the sand, the student will do it. So I'll say, well, this is how you do an eye of a Buddha. And then you try it and you copy it, and then you do it again and you memorize. How do you do this eye? Or how do you do an eye in an icon? And you learn by studying the models and copying them. So the eye, nose, and mouth of Mary, an angel, a saint, pretty much the same. But the Renaissance was interested in these individual characteristics of people. The culture of a civilization comes primarily from its cities. The reason being that it is in the cities where there can be more specialization. In before industrial times, it took about 9 people living as peasant farmers to support one person in the city who could specialize and focus on something else besides food sustenance. And the dominant group or caste of a city then directs and colors the culture of that civilization. So if the priesthood is the dominant caste, then it will be a priestly civilization with priestly art. Or if the warriors or knights or samurai are the dominant caste, then that will color the whole civilization, including its arts. The uniqueness of the modern Western civilization is that it is a merchant civilization. The merchants gave rise to the modern European cities and colored the whole subsequent culture. We in the modern West are a commercial, merchant, capitalist culture. And in the Middle Ages, as people improved their farming techniques, they were able to sustain more warriors, knights, to defend them. So the raiding pirates transformed themselves into traders. And pirates and traders or merchants are very similar, and often the same people would shift back and forth from one to the other. So as piracy was less viable, these pirates turned merchants settled in places that were suitable for them and for trade. And this gave rise to the modern European towns in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. Western Europe then can be looked at as a pirate merchant civilization. In the other major world civilizations of Eurasia, China, India, the Middle East, even Byzantium, the merchants were subordinate to other castes, priestly, aristocratic, warrior castes, the Confucian gentlemen. They were more often looked down upon. In the Confucian culture of China, the merchant was the lowest caste, even lower than the peasant farmer. But in the West, the merchants gave rise to the new cities after the feudal period and increasingly dominated the culture, even leading to and through the Industrial Revolution, which was a culmination of this merchant commercial revolution. The character of these pirate merchants was individualistic, aggressive, freedom-loving, free trade-loving, and more this worldly, materialistic, focused on acquisition, wealth, and attentive, highly attentive to the outer world. And as these pirate merchants grew, they became bankers and capitalists with a outlook that was quantitative, measuring, and mathematical and precise. Here is William McNeill explaining how the communities of pirate merchants are at the foundation of the modern Western culture. Eventually, he says, such merchant communities began to establish themselves permanently at some convenient location. From such nuclei, the towns of Northern Europe took form. The growth of towns occurred mainly after 1000, but the central and essential psychological and institutional forms of North European urban life were shaped in the chaotic age when piracy transformed itself into trade. In Byzantium, the Middle East, India, and China, that is all the other world civilization cultures of Eurasia, in all of them, the ethos of the townspeople contrasted fundamentally with that of the reformed pirates of northwestern Europe. Merchants and artisans of the other civilizations of Eurasia were primarily caterers to the tastes of their social superiors, officials, landlords, rulers. They were accustomed to regulation and taxation from above. In return, they relied upon the political authorities for protection. The aggressive, ruthless, and self-reliant ethos of Western European merchants was profoundly different. The distinctive characteristics of subsequent Western history arise largely from this fact, including the distinctive characteristics of subsequent Western art and art history. For in Europe, as elsewhere in the civilized world, McNeill continues, towns became the principal centers and sustainers of high culture once the brute problems of economic and military survival had been solved. We looked at the effects of the change from medieval art to Renaissance art, which were the formal elements or the arrangements of the painting, of the art, the shape given to the art, the stylistic changes. And then we looked at the cause, which was that in the late Middle Ages, the upholders of culture and the ones commissioning the art were no longer the clergy and monks for the landed aristocrats, the nobility, but were more and more the merchants. And now let's go from cause to effect and see how the fact that the merchants became the dominant caste and the guides of the culture and the commissioners of the art, how does that account for the changes in the art, the effects we see in the art? So this painting here is a portrait by the painter Jan van Eyck, and it's a portrait of Arnold, who was a merchant. He was a textile garment clothing merchant, and he commissioned this painter who was also the painter who worked for the highest people in the culture, the princes. So just the fact that this merchant is commissioning this artist shows the dominance, the status of the merchant. And so it is an example of a kind of painting that a merchant would want. In Italy, the merchant banker family, the Medicis, were ones who commissioned much of the great Italian Renaissance art and also raised and trained some of the great Renaissance artists, even from childhood. This painting of Botticelli, which is a painting of Mary and Christ, has in it, with almost equal size and prominence, members of the Medici family. And here's a painting of the great Michelangelo presenting a sculpture to one of the Medicis, who is at the center of the painting. And the different castes are differentiated in a fundamental way by what each considers most real or more real, and what is most desired or wanted by that caste. So if we think of the priestly caste, priestly monk caste, and the merchant caste, what is most real to the priest monk type and caste is the timeless, eternal, the next world. And what is most desired is union, some form of union with the eternal, what is outside of time and space, and the cause of all time and space. Whereas the merchant, what is most real to the merchant type and sensibility is things, sensible, outer, sensible things, objects. And what is most desired is the possession of those objects. Possession of those things, wealth, and material security. So among the formal elements, we saw that portraits, individual portraits, became more common in the Renaissance, much less common among the monks and clergy who were doing liturgical spiritual art. And the portraits are individualistic. They have a interest in the individual, in their individuality, in their psychology. And the art historian Arnold Hauser has a nice passage where he explains the connection of individual portraits and psychology itself, the development of modern psychology as arising from the merchants. So Hauser says the merchant looks out on the world with different eyes and from a different standpoint than his forefathers, whose interests were confined to the next world. The priest-monk class was concerned with the next world. The monk looks to another world that is perceived not by senses, but by faith or mystical contemplation or inner vision. But the merchant is looking to this world. There is also, says Hauser, a greater attention to individuals and individual psychology. This psychological alertness is more than anything else a product of urban life and of commercialism. The real incentive of psychological observation comes from the fact that knowledge of human nature, the correct psychological assessment of one's business partner, is among the most essential requisites of the merchant. Every detail of daily life becomes an object of observation and description. Not only human beings, but also animals and trees, not only nature, but also the home and the furniture in the home, become themes of artistic interests in themselves. Whereas the monk will efface some of the individuality. Monks all wear the same robes, the same clothes, follow the same schedule. But the merchant's life, the observation, perception, and judgment of individual character and psychology is crucial to being a merchant. We also saw that there was a change in Renaissance art in the use of light and shadow, shown in one way by the fact that things cast shadows. There are cast shadows in their paintings. Cast shadows are the measurement of time. And in a priestly culture that is interested in the timeless and eternal, and that is wanting to picture and portray and symbolize the next world, the timeless, eternal world, it makes sense that they would not include cast shadows. Nothing would cast a shadow in timeless eternity. But here in this painting, we see, even in the inside, like this cast shadow coming here, and it shows us that the sun must be up above somewhere, coming down, sending its light. So we can tell even the time of day by the cast shadow. Whereas in icons in Romanesque and Egyptian painting, you cannot tell at all what time, and because they're interested in the timeless. But the merchant is interested in time, space, the things in this world, their locations, their measurements. The formal element of perspective, or more accurately, a single viewpoint mathematical perspective, this fits and follows from the individualism of these pirates turned merchants who know things, attain a knowledge of what is most real to them, the outer sensible objects, not through inner meditations or contemplations or visions or revelations or faith, but through counting and measuring and calculations. And so the measuring of space, of time, and the objects of space and time is a development of the merchant's sense, maybe kind of the adaptation among this groups of humans to the outer sensible objects and the trade and exchange and making of sensible objects. The contemplative monk is reaching for the view of eternity, and from that view, as Burckhardt said, the sensible objects of this world are like snowflakes, appearing, dissolving, recrystallizing, reappearing, dissolving. So they are less real than the eternal, unchanging things. But for the merchant type, those things are more real. The timeless, eternal, the things that cannot be sensed, cannot be counted and measured, are for them less real. And so from these kind of deep inner orientations of the different types of people and the different fundamental castes or tasks and professions that are required for a human complex civilization. From those adaptations and orientations arise a different sense toward aspects of the world, a different feeling for which things feel more real and which less real, and what is most wanted, sought, and desired. And each of these contributes to the whole society. But the unique and very interesting uniqueness of the modern Western world is it is a world civilization developed by the merchant caste, whereas in other world civilizations, the merchants were in their position and status and work were subordinate to other castes. So we can look at the Renaissance as a merchant revolution and an expression of the beginnings of this commercial, mercantile exploration of the world through counting, measuring, and calculating.